I am lucky in many ways that I have ADHD, which means I get to have things be new multiple times. There's nothing more fun than discovering something for the first time, right? Now imagine you can discover the same thing multiple times. It's a great gift. Ideas I've had before, great songs I've discovered, wonderful thinkers that I have read before and forgotten, and then discovered again for the first time. For me, it's fun to learn things I've learned before. It drives my wife nuts. I'm sure it's driven my parents crazy over the years. My kids think it's one of their best jokes. Yeah, Dad, remember the last time you discovered that? It's fun to remember things we've forgotten and learned again. And you don't have to have ADD to have learned something over and over, right? In some ways, we've all been there. You hear a joke that you had forgotten, and suddenly you're entertained all over again. You hear a story from your childhood that you had worked hard to forget, but someone reminds you again, and the memories flood back. Or you discover an emotion that you had forgotten could move you so. Laughter after a long season of sadness. Love after a time when you had turned your heart off in self-defense. Hope after an isolated time alone, separated from others, an isolated reality we've trapped ourselves in, whether it comes from despair, anger, hate, ignorance, or greed, all of them can leave us feeling helpless in the end. And there's something beautiful about discovering hope again. It can happen for individuals, but it also happens in communities. The family that's lost their sense of humor, that suddenly has a breakthrough and learns how to laugh and play together again. A town that has forgotten how to love. I think they call that movie Footloose, right? A church that's forgotten how to hope, that's so worried about its present, so worried about where they've been, so worried about all the hurts around that they've forgotten how to hope and how to dream. It happens all the time. But the good news is we can rediscover it at any time. We can open our eyes again to what God has been doing. We can see God again like it's for the first time. We can discover goodness and love and find hope again for the first time. Revelation 21 tells us, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them, and they will be God's people, and God will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." We talked a couple weeks ago about how apocalyptic literature like Revelation is written to people for whom dying tomorrow sounded like hope. Remember, we're not the intended audience for most apocalyptic literature, so we have to wrap our brain around the idea that they were being promised an end as a new beginning. And they found hope in that message. But it's interesting, this is shared as a promise for the future. But hadn't God done it already? Think about the imagery. God among mortals, God dwelling with people, God claiming people as God's very own. Doesn't it sound a lot like the beginning with Adam and Eve? People created in the image of God, created as partners with God, caretakers of creation. Maybe we just forgot. But then God did it again later in Genesis with Abraham and Sarah. "I'll be your God and you will be my people." An everlasting covenant. The Jewish community still writes it as the Shema on scrolls and puts it in a little mezuzah box on their door. They touch it or even kiss their fingers and touch it as a reminder as they come in and out, fearful that we might forget. Fearful that we might forget that the promise has been made all along, that God has been present with us all along, but maybe we've forgotten. Jesus seems to understand that we forget. If you read Jesus' words, if you pay attention to his ministry, he's clearly someone who understands we're forgetful. He's always explaining things again about the law for those who might have missed it. He's always explaining things again, especially for the disciples who never seem to get it the first time. He's always explaining things again in a new way. You forgot about God's grace? Let me tell you a story about a father who had two sons. You've forgotten about God's love? Let me tell you about a sheep and a shepherd. You've forgotten about hope? Let me tell you about a mustard seed. Jesus seemed to understand that we forget. So he would invite people to dinner to talk through their choices and how they got to them. He would tell stories to remind people who they are, who they really are. And he would orchestrate spectacles that allowed him to make some point that we should have already known, but we seem to have forgotten. Sometimes Jesus was plotting it out, like the palm and donkey show that he puts on entering Jerusalem before the crucifixion. This is a spectacle meant to remind them who they are, where they've come from, and who they could be. Other times, he just takes advantage of the moment, of the opportunity. Like when the children are being excluded from the circle of teaching and welcome. And Jesus draws them in, and more than draws them in, allows them to be the lesson of the day. Thank goodness Jesus understands that we forget. Forget that we're loved. Forget that all people are part of creation and God's beloved. Forget that mystery doesn't have to be explained. Forget that grace feeds us more than greed. Forget that scarcity is a myth created by fear. Forget that God is with us. We forget that God wins. We forget that God is with us and that God wins. Maybe that's what was happening on that lake shore when Jesus fed 5,000 people somehow. Do you remember the story? 5,000 showed up, 5,000 people with absolutely no respect for boundaries. Jesus has already been tired. He's tried to get away, and the crowds have followed him. He's healed. He's taught. He's been with them. And day is getting late, and the disciples say, "We should send them home, Jesus. They need food." And we don't want that responsibility. Send them home, Jesus. It seems they had forgotten about hospitality as a core concept of their tradition. They seem to have forgotten Jesus' teachings, his healings. The disciples, the experts at forgetting, asked Jesus about food. And Jesus looks at him and says, "You feed them." Forgetting who Jesus is, forgetting all they've seen, the disciples explain how impossible the task is with so little. But Jesus says, "No, feed them." Attempting to make sense of this command, they explain the situation. Jesus just doesn't seem to know as much as they do. "We only have a few fish and loaves, Jesus." And Jesus responds, "Feed them." The bread and the fish are blessed and shared. Miraculously, there are leftovers. Not just enough to feed, but there are leftovers. So do you think Jesus performs a miracle and multiplied the food? Let's not forget, Jesus has done miracles before. He's transformed water into wine. What are a few fish and loaves into abundance? Or do you think Jesus created a spectacle where people were inspired to share? Don't forget, Jesus often inspired, cajoled, reminded us who we are, leading to a change of heart. What if there was plenty of food for everyone, but people forgot to share, forgot how to share? What if there was plenty to drink for everyone, but people forgot how to be a community? What if there was more than enough for them and for us, but we've all forgotten how to share? What if there was enough for them and for us, but we've forgotten how to share? What would be a bigger miracle? Multiplying bread or motivating stingy, greedy people into sharing? What would be a bigger miracle? Multiplying mackerel or getting scared people to find hope and compassion again? What would be a bigger miracle? Making something out of nothing or making something beautiful out of us? What would be a bigger miracle? Something out of nothing or getting us to discover hope again? In the face of fear, in the case of the news, in the face of all of the lies, the misdirected hate, the need to blame, what would be a greater miracle? Creating something of nothing or reminding us to hope again, getting us to discover it again like it's for the first time. It doesn't take much. It's all there right inside of us, created in the image of God. We were filled with the very breath of God at the beginning of creation. We were claimed into covenant with God and assured of God's love by Jesus. It doesn't take much. It's right there inside of us. Once we remember, once we're reminded, we are reminded of what hospitality and sharing look like. And when we do, there is plenty of bread and fish to share. There is plenty of cookies and food to host a meal. There is plenty of love for all who come seeking. We're reminded what care and compassion look like, and suddenly there's plenty for our church to share. There's plenty to welcome in others with open arms. There is plenty for all of us. When we are reminded what hope looks like, suddenly there is a new vision. Suddenly an old familiar future is waiting on us. Once we remember, once we are reminded that God is with us, that God dwells with humankind, that we are all God's people, and old wisdom is echoed anew again. Old love is rekindled like for the first time. Old stories are remembered and told as if they are new, and God is still speaking, yet still echoing the ancient story. Old dreams become new pathways. Old friends become new partners. Old promises become new possibilities. Old promises become brand new possibilities because we remember again like it's the first time. We rediscover God is dwelling in our hearts. God is challenging our limits. God is calling in our ear. See, I am making all things new. Remember and join me.